So, welcome everybody. My name is Reid, and thank you for joining today. Today, we're going to be looking at how to guide people through change in a way that's both effective and humane. And we'll be focusing on three pillars, and those pillars are empathy, narrative, and involvement. And this builds on a lot of what firms like McKinsey have found over decades of transformational work. Simply that most change efforts don't fail because the strategy is wrong, but because the human side of change and the underlying culture weren't properly addressed. So, as we go through, I will occasionally point to how these ideas connect with McKinsey's thinking on organizational culture and what they term the 3S framework. So, in other words, how we align strategy, structure, systems, skills, staff, style, and shared values around change. So here's how we'll structure the session. So first of all, we're going to look at the business case. So why is it that around 70% of transformations still fail? And what is the impact of that? Secondly, we're going to look at the new reality, why change is now part of everyone's day job. Then we're going to look at the neuroscience and psychology. If we're putting people at the heart of our change management projects, then it's really important that we understand what motivates people and what brings out the best and the worst in people during these sort of periods of change. We're then going to look at a framework called the HERE framework, and it's a practical tool for empathetic communication. And it's something I use quite often when I'm working with organizations around culture change or organizational change. We're then going to look at how we can craft a narrative around change. So building a clear now, why, future story. We'll then look at designing involvement and how it is that you can move from passive compliance to a more co-creative process. We'll look at how you can measure success, and then finally look at some practical strategies and next steps you can take away and apply. And if you know McKinsey's 7S framework, you'll notice we're touching on almost all of them in what we're going to be discussing over the next hour. So we're looking at the narrative and strategy piece, the systems of feedback and measurement, the skills and staff we develop as change agents, the leadership style we adopt, and ultimately the shared values and culture we reinforce. And when we look at the data, the message, unfortunately, is very sobering. It's estimated that around 70% of transformation projects fail. And based on my own experience, but also research that's been done by McKinsey, there are really three recurring impacts of failure of a change management project. The first one is financial impact. So it's the wasted investment and the missed return on investment. The cultural impact, how trust becomes eroded and engagement drops. So in other words, some of the impact of change management projects when they don't go well is not just about the change project itself, it's about how the organization is above and beyond that. And there's a reputational impact as well. So how the employer brand may suffer. And crucially, for me, that the root cause of all of these things is exactly the same in each scenario. It's really employee resistance and the lack of management support. So again, from a 7S lens, that's a misalignment between the strategy that we may have defined, the systems and the structures that we've created, and the style of leadership and shared values that people actually experience. And so often organizations and leadership profess certain values and a certain culture, but actually change management projects are really when those things truly get tested and put under the spotlight. And there's often a gap between what is professed and the reality of people's experience. So the answer to all this really is to put empathy, narrative, and involvement in the center. And those are what make the soft elements of the organization. So in other words, culture, leadership style, shared values, strong enough to support the hard element of change management. Okay, so let's move on to the neuroscience. And as I'm sure many of you will know, the human brain reads unmanaged organizational change in many ways as a survival threat. The primitive part of the brain, what we often call the lizard brain, doesn't understand and doesn't like uncertainty and not knowing, and it often reacts to it almost in a fight or flight type of response that we often associate with more extreme situations. And some of the main reasons why this happens is because people experience potential loss of status, certainty, autonomy, and fairness, all core drivers in models like David Rock's SCARF framework that many of you, I'm sure, will know. And if my status feels questioned as part of a process like this, then inevitably, on some level, I'm going to try and protect my identity. And that will often manifest through resistance. And if uncertainty is low, my brain often will go searching for threats. And this is often where the rumor mill starts to come into effect and people start to react in all kinds of extreme ways. And if autonomy drops, I feel controlled. And if fairness feels absent, it may be that I start to disengage or even leave. And from a change management perspective, resistance isn't always necessarily about difficult behavior for the sake of difficult behavior. Often it's a predictable, neurologically driven response. And if we preempt that, we can do a lot to mitigate against it, or at the very least to acknowledge it when people have reactions to the processes that are being implemented. And in McKinsey's terms, if we ignore all of this, then we undermine the style of leadership that we want and the shared values we espouse. Things like trust and transparency, which I think most of us would agree are vital to any thriving culture within an organization. And essentially, I guess our job is to create that psychological safety that so resistance can be discussed in the open and gradually turn into curiosity and hopefully then engagement. And as we've already said, when people face change, the amygdala, in other words, the fear receptor within the brain, switches on, and we go into this fight or flight mode where cortisol, which is a stress hormone, becomes more prevalent, and the frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and creativity and self-control, begins to become increasingly impaired. And that happens with individuals. It can also happen within teams or the wider organization. And on the individual level, if we see reduced, we often see reduced well-being, anxiety, burnout, poor sleep, performance drops, decision quality falls, and error rates may well go up too. Whereas at a team level, as psychological safety declines, people speak up less, collaboration and trust suffer, all the things that are the underpinning for high quality work. And that's why I think empathy and narrative are not nice to have. They are neurological necessities because they help to calm the threat response and restore that higher order thinking that we need for impactful work. And again, if we link all of this back to the 7S model, then our leadership style and people systems need to intentionally support psychological safety. Otherwise, any level of carefully managed design and strategy and structure simply won't land. On this next slide, you can see a typical change curve, which I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with. And essentially what happens here is that as we go through a change, the theory is that we move from denial and anger through to resistance, into exploration, acceptance, and ultimately commitment. But how we actually move through this curve varies enormously. Some people will move through it very quickly. Some people will move through it in a very sequential way. Other people oscillate and go back and forth. And I think there are 2 points really to tease out of this. And one is that to some degree, resistance is a normal emotional response, not a failure. It's how, in some ways, we're designed to be. So if we acknowledge that, we can use it as feedback and a way to collaborate with people. But actually, people and teams also, as we've just touched on, move through the curve at different speeds. And so if we're trying to drive new structures and systems into an organization that is still largely in denial or anger, then we end up meeting what McKinsey often calls change on paper, but not change in behavior. And so it's really important that we meet individuals, we meet teams where they are in this process, not where we assume that they are or based on our perception of how things are. And for those of you on this call, I think really our role as leaders and HR practitioners is to meet people where they are in this curve and use that empathy and narrative to help them move towards exploration and commitment to the process. So how do we do this? Well, this is where the HEAR framework comes into play. So HEAR. It's a simple but powerful tool for conversations during change, and indeed whenever there is any level of contention. So the H stands for hear. And this is really about really genuinely listening without interrupting and giving the person or the team space to express their perspective and concerns without interrupting or trying to close down or dismiss their viewpoint. The E stands for empathize. So this is acknowledging the emotional impact, and it might be saying phrases like, I can see this is frustrating. I understand why this feels uncertain. The A stands for acknowledge. So this is really about summarizing back what you've heard. And this really builds trust and psychological safety. And it's then that people start to hopefully feel genuinely seen and understood. And this is the basis for co-collaboration. And then finally, R for respond. And it's only then that you can provide clear, honest answers and outline next steps and support. And when you're providing this sort of empathetic communication, it doesn't mean that you have to agree and embrace every concern or every suggestion about change to the existing process. It simply is about making people feel respected in the process rather than having something done to them. And again, from a 7S viewpoint, here is a critical skill that we want to build, especially from middle management, because it helps to shape our leadership style and reinforce the shared values that presumably we want the culture to be known for. The second core element is the change story itself. And this is where it's useful to think in this sort of three-step process of now, why, future. And essentially now is about starting by acknowledging the current reality in an honest and authentic way, naming the challenges, validating people's existing concerns. And the second step is why. So this is really about explaining the business rationale for why we're going through this change and the potential challenges and difficulties that people have with that. And when people can understand the purpose behind something, they are more likely to engage with it and they're more likely to withstand that difficulty. So explaining the business rationale, why change is necessary, how it connects to our core purpose and the long-term strategy. And then finally, future. And so often when we're going through change, people experience anxiety. Anxiety is future-focused fear, not necessarily about what is happening, but what we perceive could be about to happen. So it's really important that we paint a vivid, concrete picture of the future state and crucially, what it means for individual roles. And the more that we can paint a clear picture of that, the more people are likely to have optimism to withstand any current challenges whilst they go through that process. And one key point from McKinsey's work on transformation is that leaders under communicate the why by a huge margin. And certainly I've seen this in my work with organizations. People don't resist change as much as they resist being changed without a story that makes sense. And it's really important to tailor that narrative to your audience. So whether that's frontline employees, middle managers, or executives, everybody's got different priorities, different teams, different roles. All of these people will be coming with slightly different concerns or aspirations from the project. So seeing people as individuals rather than as collective is really, really important. And then finally, the other thing I'd say is it's really about consistency. Consistency beats perfection. So it's better to keep repeating an 80% perfect story rather than wait months to provide a fully fledged 100% polished story. Because in the meantime, the rumor mill will be running and people generally fill that vacuum and not necessarily in a positive way. So to be ahead of that narrative is really, really important, even if it's to make it clear to people that we can't give them the full story right now because things are still unfolding. So let's have a look at the next stage of this. It's really about change agents. So what do we mean by a change agent? Well, a change agent isn't a cheerleader who blindly supports a project. It's really about having somebody who's an honest translator between the project team or senior management and the front line. And the kind of people you might choose for this are people who are trusted by their peers. They're not necessarily people who are in formal management or leadership roles, although they could be. It's simply those people who are trusted, that have some degree of uh, recognized respect from other people. And they'd like to be people who are comfortable with a degree of ambiguity. So, in other words, from a psychological point of view, they're quite stable. They're not people who are going to be strongly affected by the change themselves or adversely affected by hearing difficult feedback from other people. And more than that, they're going to be people who are confident and have the remit to be able to give candid feedback upwards. So whatever they hear from the front line, to be able to feed that back to the project management team or the senior leadership team in an authentic way that potentially helps to inform how that process continues to unfold. And what do they do? Well, essentially, as we've already said, they translate the strategy into plain frontline language, and they surface real-time feedback from teams and individuals that can help, as we've said, to inform the project going forwards. Also, they may be people who pilot new approaches and share what's working. So we can double down on some of those things that are working very well. And the organizations that do this well are significantly more likely to meet their change objectives with high involvement approaches. And it's estimated by McKinsey that those organizations that do are 1.3 times more likely to have an effective outcome to their change management project. And if we look at this through the 3S lens again, essentially what change agents are doing is helping to align the strategy, the systems, in other words, getting involved in the feedback loops and pilots, and finally the staff and skills. So helping those people to make the change real on the ground. And often the best change agents are not the loudest voices. They're the people others go to when they're confused or concerned. And to truly leverage those change agents, we need to design their environment carefully. And for me, there are really three outcomes we're aiming for here. And the first one is engagement. So establishing continuous feedback loops. Adoption, so co-creating processes with end users, using pilots to refine before scaling. And resilience, so building deep psychological safety and peer-to-peer support. And very often, people are reluctant to speak to their line managers about their concerns. And so having this sort of semi-formal, informal interface can also be really effective in terms of really understanding what's going on. So, on a practical level, this is really about empowering your local change agents, running iterative pilot programs and scaling quick wins, facilitating transparent two-way dialogues between leadership and the front line, and embedding new ways of working into daily workflows rather than as big one-off initiatives. And this is how we avoid what I call change theatre, so performative ways of implementing change that make a big deal of including people, actually aren't really including people. So it's lots of communication, but little behavior change. And that's really what we want to avoid. What we want instead is to embed change into the systems and structure of the organization while reinforcing the culture and shared values we want. Okay, so what we have here is a template for a 30-day change playbook. And obviously, some of your projects may run for longer or shorter than this, but this is just to give you an example. And obviously, you may need to adopt the timelines according to the nature of your particular project or projects. But if you only had three things to do in the next 30 days, here's what I would recommend. So in week 1 or 2, pilot that HERE framework conversation that we touched on earlier. So in other words, pick one team or one critical stakeholder group and use that here model in a structured conversation around current change efforts. And notice what shifts when people feel properly heard. And then in week 2 to 3, run a change fatigue check-in. So identify one group that's showing resistance or fatigue and ask a simple question. In other words, how many changes are you absorbing right now? How many changes are you absorbing right now? And use their responses to prioritize and perhaps to sequence those initiatives to reduce the level of overwhelm they may be experiencing. And then moving into weeks 3 and 4, craft a concise now, why, future story for your current transformation and test it with the team and refine based on their feedback where necessary. And as you get beyond that 30 days, then it's about rolling into a more complete roadmap. So it might be that months 1 to 2, you assess the baselines and you deploy the narrative. Whereas in months 3 to 4, you activate the change agents and you run some co-creation workshops. And then moving into months 5 to 6, looking at measure adoption, how you measure adoptions and how you iterate and anchor the things that are working. And this is how you begin to align those 7S elements that we spoke about earlier in practice. So the strategy and the narrative, the systems of feedback and measurement, the skills and staff you develop, all of those things reinforcing the shared values of the type of culture that you want. One of the risks is that people don't measure how things are working during the process. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, for organizations to finish a roll up and then ask, so how did it work? So instead, what we want to be doing is building those sort of measurement checkpoints from day one. So here are 3 key dimensions you might want to consider. So the first one is adoption. So are people actually using the new processes, technology, or system? What's the level of participation, usage, or compliance looking like? And secondly, sentiment. How do people feel about the change? So you might use pulse surveys, qualitative feedback, or focus groups to gauge this, or a combination of all of those. And then finally, looking at proficiency and outcomes. So are people competent in a new way of working? Are we hitting the intended business KPIs? All of these things will give us an idea of how things are going. And if we're doing this little and often, then we've got lots of opportunities to course correct in smaller, more measured ways that don't create additional disruption. And research from Prosky and McKinsey shows that organizations with excellent change management are far more likely to meet their goals, stay on schedule, and stay under budget. And again, from 7S perspective, that's where systems and metrics close the loop. We ensure that our strategy is translating into real behavioral change, supported by the right skills and style of leadership. So on this next slide, I've broken some practical steps down for you, depending on where you sit in terms of your role. So first of all, we're going to look at things that HR professionals can do, and then we're going to look at things more broadly that senior leaders can start to do. So if you're an HR professional, really 3 things to think about here. Number 1 is building capability. So particularly those middle managers, equipping them with active listening and dialogue skills, because it's not uncommon for people to have a very patchy experience of change management based upon who their line manager is and how empathetic and how readily able to hold the line that manager is. It's also about designing feedback loops. So implementing agile pulse surveys and listening mechanisms so that sentiment is visible in real time. So again, it gives you more opportunities to course correct and to demonstrate to people that you are seriously reflective on the things that they talk about in relation to change management. And it's about aligning systems, so adjusting performance and reward systems to recognize change adoption, collaboration, and support for others. And if you're a senior leader listening to this webinar, then again, 3 things to consider. The first one is embody the change. So in other words, visibly role model the change that you want to see. And again, my experience of working in these kind of situations, and again, the feedback from McKinsey shows that when it comes to culture, people generally do what they see, not what they read in the memo. And how often do we have a mismatch between what an organization professes and what leadership promote versus what they genuinely manifest? So if you want people to take things seriously and take it on board, then you need to be the change that you want to happen. Secondly, over communicate the why. I would almost say you want to get to the point where people are fed up of hearing about the why, and then you know that you've done your job. So anchoring operational updates back to that core vision and strategy. And then finally, showing vulnerability. Even in this day and age, it's very, very common for leaders to feel that they have to appear infallible and to pretend everything's perfect when actually maybe it's not. So within reason, acknowledging uncertainty and challenge helps to build psychological safety and trust. And again, in 7S language, as an HR professional or a leader, you are the main shapers of style, staff, skills, and systems. And you are the guardians of the organization's shared values. So really important that you consider these things that we've outlined here. And finally, just to wrap up, I want to give you a few tangible takeaways from today's session. So here are 5 key points to consider. So firstly, expect resistance. There's going to be resistance baked into almost any change management process. It's a normal psychological and neurological process and response, not a failure. And if you use it effectively, it's actually an opportunity to embrace that, to use that resistance as a form of feedback, to potentially inform the process, but also to forge deeper bonds and ties with people and accentuate the quality of the culture within the organization. And tied in with that, communicate with empathy. So using tools like the HERE framework help to ensure that people feel seen and heard. And that can have massive positive ramifications above and beyond the immediate change management project if you get it right. And thirdly, structure your narrative. So again, consistently connect any conversations and communications back to the now, why, and future. Use that as your anchor. Fourthly, involve people, but involve people authentically. So move from that involvement theatre, that performative element that we spoke about earlier, to genuine co-creation and feedback. And then finally, measure continuously. So track adoption, sentiment, and outcomes from the very start. So you've got more opportunity to show people that you're interested and curious about their position about all of this, but also to allow you to course correct where necessary as quickly as possible. And ultimately, change is not a threat to be managed, but it's an opportunity to be led with empathy and purpose. And if we connect this back to McKinsey's 7S framework again, then successful change happens when the hard parts, the hard elements, in other words, strategy, structure, and systems, are fully aligned with the soft elements. So the things that we've primarily spoken about today. So things like skills, staff, style, and shared values. And that alignment is what we've been talking about today to a large extent. So before we finish, quick note about an upcoming session that we have running called the Ethical Influence Architecture. It's a live face-to-face session just outside of London in the UK. And this really extends many of the ideas that we've explored today, particularly around leadership presence, ethical influence, culture building. And if you're interested in deepening your capability around those soft elements of the 7S framework, so in other words, style, skills, and shared values, then this workshop is designed for you. And if you are interested, please get in touch. You can scan the QR code or send us an email to find out more. And I'll leave you with this thought, just to reiterate what we've already spoken about. So change is not a process to be managed, but a human experience to be led. Just remember that idea of human experience, and that should stand you in good stead. If you want to have a chat about your needs in more specific detail, do get in touch. You can book a free consultation using the QR code below. Be very happy to hear from you. Equally, you can email me or contact me on LinkedIn. So thank you for your time and engagement today, and I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.